Okay, good morning and welcome to session B2, everyone. We thank you for joining us. In this session, James Cross, or Jim, will be delivering his presentation on what is this thing called documentary editing, and he comes from Clemson University Libraries. And I will stop to share your presentation. Give me one moment, Jim.
Sure.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can.
All right, take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to What is this thing called documentary editing, which will provide a brief introduction to documentary editions, both print and digital. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the main campus of Clemson University occupies traditional and ancestral land of the Cherokee people. Clemson's main campus is built on land seized through U.S. military and diplomatic incursions, culminating in the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner in 1777. This is also land on which people enslaved by the Pickens, Clemson, and Calhoun families lived and worked, and that was transformed into the campus of Clemson University through convict labor. We make this acknowledgement to remember the histories of violence that anticipate our gathering here, to recognize Indigenous and Black claims to life and land, and to recenter those claims as we commit to better ways of caring for each other and for this land. So let's begin with a couple of definitions. Thank you. And first thing is documentary editing has nothing to do with documentary film editing. If you do a Google search, those are like the first 100 things that come up. Well, probably not that many, but that's what a lot of people think what documentary editing is referring to. And next slide, please. One thing you need to note is that these definitions are less what it is as opposed to what it does. They're procedures, techniques, and best practices that lead to the goals of documentary editing. Next slide, please. Trustworthy text, making material available, and making it accessible. Next slide, please. Okay. This I admit is my little soapbox for this presentation. We like to talk about accessible in a way of what we're really saying is making it available. People can look at it, people can read it, especially if we do a transcription, but it may not really be accessible. And the various techniques shown on this screen are ways of actually doing that. There's also considering ADA. Context is important. And even if we're not creating a documentary edition, we can use these techniques to help make our materials more intellectually accessible. For example, next slide, please. All right. You do a Google search on World War II and you land on the August 2nd, 1945 entry in Special Assistant to the Secretary of State Walter Brown's journal and read this. We all came aboard the Augusta at about 2 p.m. or 12 o'clock Plymouth time. The president, JFB, and Leahy were piped over, and a launch took them over to the Renown, where they had lunch with the king. Okay. Well, this is perfectly available, and due to the transcription, it's certainly accessible. I can read it, but there are a few questions that come to mind. What is the Augusta? Where is Plymouth? Which president are we talking about? Who are JFB and Leahy? What does piped over mean? What is the Renown? And what and which king are we talking about? The answer to those questions are in order: a US Navy cruiser in the United Kingdom, President Harry S. Truman, Secretary of State James F. Burns, and Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, President Truman. A naval ceremony when someone either leaves or boards a ship, a Royal Navy battle cruiser, and King George VI of the United Kingdom. So even though people could read this without that context, they might not exactly understand what it was they were reading. Next slide, please. So a little context on documentary editing. It's been around for a while, but really exploded starting in the 1950s. The Jefferson Papers project started in December 1943, and it's still going on. Locally, the Calhoun Papers project was also a part of the American Statesman publishing effort. The first volume was in 1959. The last was in 2003. And this literary textual editing that I mentioned, it's an heir to classical scholarship, which had to rely on flawed scribal copies rather than originals. And therefore, they were trying to get to the quote unquote original text. Next slide, please. What happened was textual editors began to realize that more than the authors are involved in creating a text. You have editors, publishers, typesetters, and others playing a role. So their editions began to look more like historical editions. Documentary editors, on the other hand, began to question the utility of heavily amended transcriptions they had been creating. And like the slide says, then came computers and the internet. Next slide, please. So, conceptualizing the project, here are the various things that you need to think about. Some of these, like project goals, staff, funding, partnerships, sustainability, are the kinds of things that you would have to think about in any project. But some are really unique to doing documentary editions. Each of these will affect how you plan the project. Next slide, please. And your specific goals in each area. As you can see, we've got context-specific goals, platform, tool-specific goals, publication goals, and there are other things that can be considered with the way you conceptualize the project impacting the goals that you have for it. Next slide, please. So, historically, we started out with print editions. And this is what a print edition will generally consist of. And we'll get back to those statements of editorial policies a bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. These are the elements that you would see for digital edition. As you might expect, it can contain everything you would include in a print edition, but you have some extra options because it's digital. Next slide, please. Okay, if you're doing a digital edition, it doesn't change things as far as what the main goals are in doing a documentary edition. And I cannot emphasize enough the need to look at other digital editions to help decide how you want to design your own. Next slide, please. Transparency is very important in documentary editions, no matter what the format. Editorial, selection, transcription, and annotation policies need to be developed, recorded, and provided in some way to the user so they understand what decisions were made as you were creating the edition. And you'll see some of those decisions or possible decisions later on in the presentation. But, you know, if you decided that you were not going to show crossed off words, you need to let the person using it know that, especially if you have an image of the original document right next to the transcript. So it's important that an explanation of the editorial practices used on the text be available to the user. Next slide, please. All right, here we have digital versus print editions. Digital is on the left, print is on the right. Digital is certainly ascendant these days, but there may be good reasons for considering a print edition. Each has its strengths and weaknesses, and there's nothing that says that you can't do both. You may want to do an online edition, but say you have a university press as part of your library, you may think that this would be a good candidate for publication by the press as well. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be both. Next slide, please. Okay, selection policy, comprehensive. You need to define what that means, because here's the dirty little secret. No edition is really comprehensive. There are always going to be some things that you leave out. I mean, just an example of some of the things that you could put in a comprehensive edition: records of organizations that they might have seen, scraps of paper with doodles, newspaper clippings they kept, material created after your subject died, really good documents written about them. All of those could be included in a comprehensive edition. And there are a lot of other things that you could probably think of that you could include. The question would be, should you include those? And then we have, as the slide shows, some other considerations as far as selection policy is concerned. The question about size could be due to staffing limitation, time limits, or space. Next slide, please. Selection is one of the most important things that you will do, and it's the most time consuming. And it will need you to make some hard decisions. You're thinking of both what you want to include and what you do not want to include. And by the way, this would be one of the policies that you would include in your documentary edition so that the user would know what it, not only what is in the edition, but what is not there. Next slide, please. Organization. Being able to find things, whether it's you or the user. There's a need for consistency so that people know what to expect. Indexes and searches. Digital editions, metadata is going to impact how you will be able to organize your document. When you're talking about thematic parts, give you an example. The papers of George Washington are divided into diaries, colonial series, Revolutionary War series, Confederation series, presidential series, and retirement series, all dealing with themes related to his life. Whatever divisions you decide upon should be driven by the content and not the publication format. Next slide, please. So if you're planning to use more than one source of documents, for example, you want to do both sides of a correspondence between two people, or you're trying to be comprehensive, so you want all of the documents created by this person, whether or not they're in your repository or not. That means you have to start collecting. So again, you have to define what it is you're looking for. Search and record what you find and don't find, and integrate those new documents into our collection for the digital edition. These are the methods by which you can find documents that you might be interested in. And you can even use databases like Ancestry.com or Family Search to track down descendants to see if they might have material you'd be interested in. Next slide, please. If you're collecting all of these documents, you need to be able to control them intellectually, and if you're doing something like getting photocopies and that sort of thing, physically. Once we use index cards, now it's most likely we'd be using database content management systems. Some ways it's very analogous to cataloging system. You need to put a great deal of thought into what metadata to collect, since this will greatly impact how effective the system will be in searching and managing your data. Next slide, please. Yes, transcription is the backbone of the edition. This is the first thing you will do in order to make the material intellectually accessible to people. And as noted, in a digital edition, this becomes the basis for searches and interpretive tools, such as text analysis. Next slide, please. This is going to be the first and most important decision you will need to make concerning transcription. How faithful should we be to the original text? Well, it's going to depend. Audience, edition design, search plans, display plans. And remember that digital editions will often have a broader use than print editions. Nobody has a policy that seeks to render a facsimile of the original. Usually portions of the document, the salutation, date, location, paragraph, formatting, etc., are regularized to make it more accessible. And this is okay. You're not breaking the rules if you do this. Next slide, please. Pardon me. These issues are only a few of the ones that are involved when you're making decisions about transcriptions. And you might notice codes and ciphers. Well, yes, the folks at USC can talk to you about that because they had to deal with codes and ciphers in the papers of the Revolutionary Era Pinckney Statesman digital edition that they created. Next slide, please. The middle sentence in the slide is important to remember. There's no right answer. You need to be consistent in what you do, but this is something that is going to be unique to your edition. And the transcription policy is truly a living document. No matter how well you plan, changes will need to be made as you encounter new issues or as previous decisions impact accessibility, searching, etc. And again, you need to make the rules accessible to everyone. Next slide, please. The next stage, one of the important stages after you've actually transcribed the material in the entire transcription project is proofreading. All transcriptions need to be proofread. The document is likely going to go through this process more than once. In fact, generally it is thought that it should be proofread at least twice before it goes forward into the edition. Often when using a team reading approach, the reader and the recorder will switch. Next slide, please. Why annotate? Accessibility. And for all of the reasons that are shown on this slide. Next slide, please. And as you might expect, you've got more decisions to make as far as how much you will annotate and what kind of annotation you will do. This will depend on your audience, on the document itself, and resources available beyond the edition to help the user understand references in the document. I mean, they could Google, they could go to Wikipedia. The question is, would this, take them out of the document and break their concentration and their study of the document? But those are options, so those need to be taken into account. Next slide, please. Some of the forms of annotation that are listed here work better or can only work in digital edition, such as various kinds of directories and digital visualizations. Next slide, please. When you're designing the policy, the amount of annotation in an edition is a very subjective distinction that only the editor can make. One must take into account how readily accessible the information is, As I said, how disruptive searching for that information might be on the reading experience. For this, you really need to look at other digital editions, talk to potential users, and look at digital humanities sites, see what cutting edge scholars want. And next slide, please. Oops, back one. I just wanted to emphasize that you need to decide what you're going to annotate, what you're not going to annotate, and then let the reader know what you've done. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Would you like for me to stop sharing my screen? Do you have time, or do you want me to?
We can go
continue?
ahead. Next slide, please. Yeah, there's a lot more that could be said about this, but as I said at the beginning, this is a brief introduction to the topic. Here are a few resources that go into more depth and cover things that I was not able to in this presentation. The first two books listed are considered standards in the field. Next slide, please. And here are links to two of the major organizations in documentary editing. And I'm going to make note that the Association for Documentary Editing, the information in this presentation came primarily from the Institute for the Editing of Historical Documents at Princeton University that I attended in 2019. Starting in 2022, instruction on the fundamentals of documentary editing will be held online in a course titled Fundamentals. This will be a project by the ADE and NHPRC, as was the original in-person seminars. Fundamentals will include a curriculum comparable to that of the formerly in-person institute. Also on this slide are links to some documentary editions to look at. Some things about those. The Thoreau site allows one to compare different versions of Walden side by side, and there are about like 6 of them. If you're looking for an example of thematic divisions, the Whitman Archive is a good example of that. And within the George Washington papers, the Financial Papers Project provides an example of transcribing and providing access to something other than correspondence. They're actually giving access to cash books and ledger book. It also has some very interesting visualizations in its learning center. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Jim, for sharing your presentation. We really appreciate that. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat. I guess I'll start it off with one. You talked about developing transcription guidelines. Who are some of the folks who should be considered at that table with developing those guidelines?
Well, I mean, it depends on your audience. Who are you doing this for? And when you've decided that, then those people are stakeholders. And, you know, if one of the groups that you want to make this edition available for is, say, to help elementary and secondary school teachers, then you need to talk with them. You need to say, okay, this is what we have. You know, what would make it easy for them? Now, I will say that unless you're doing something that's like a literary edition, a lot of people are okay with not doing, you know, every little thing. Like if something's crossed out and replaced with something else, well, don't show off the crossed out part, you know, just show. Or if you've got in interpolation, you know, the little caret and then something written above it, rather than showing that in the transcription, you just put it where it would be in the transcription. I mean, especially if you're working where you're going to have an image right next to the transcription. You know, if they're really interested in it, they can see it. They can see that this line of text was interpolated into this. I mean, again, it depends on your audience as to when this is going to be, what you need to do as far as transcription is concerned. And Bill, funny you should say that. These slides are available.
Yes, we will be making the slides, and Jim also has a handout. We'll be making those available after the conference, along with the conference program and any other slides that our presenters wish to share. They will be made available on Google Drive, and so we'll send out a link to everyone to be able to access them.
So yes, most of everything that I said, or at least the things on the slide, will be available to you.
Yes. And we have one question from Anne. She says, could something like this be used to give context to an online digital collection, not a traditional text or book?
Yes, in fact, documentary editions, it's not just taking an already printed documentary edition and, you know, digitizing it in some way. There are an awful lot of projects that are making, you know, an online digital collection, whether this was originally in paper format or born digital, but providing this online. That's why I wanted to say that you might not be doing a full-blown documentary edition, but if you're digitizing, say, a collection and you're transcribing it, you may want to think about at least providing some context when it's not clear. For example, people use pet names in family correspondence. You know, if you're not familiar with that family, then as you're reading it, you're not going to know who that's referring to. But something that says, okay, this is referring to this person, would be very helpful to the reader. So yes, you can use it in an online digital collection. Will take a little more work and you'll have to figure out how you want to incorporate it, but yeah, you could do that.
And she has a follow-up. Are there any examples of that you're aware of?
Not necessarily with born digital, but if I can share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay. Well, these are a few of the things that I mentioned in my description. This is Walden, And as you can see, there are multiple versions of Walden, and you can compare all of them. And they very nicely do things to help you to help identify changes, not only crossed out, but different letters of text. These are the Joseph Smith papers. That has a source note where it came from. It will give you a historical introduction. As you can see, you've got links within that so that you can go and get explanations. And then, of course, you have the transcription, and you've got navigation tools over here. Here's the financial papers of George Washington. This is the transcription of Ledger A. This gives you an overview of the page, which all of these not only calculators so that you can calculate into common day terms, but the account name people will refer to, occupations of people will refer to, services that may have been provided, food and beverages. And then you actually have not only an image, but you've got a little magnifier so that you can see things a bit better. And of course, you've got the credit side of this. And remember, I talked about visualizations. This, again, is the financial papers of George Washington. And so they've done various visualizations based on data within the transcriptions. And finally, I didn't mention this, and this is maybe a bit closer to what you were thinking of. This is the Seward family digital archive. There is no print version of this. So this is an online documentary edition for the Seward family. The most famous member that you might know of is William Seward, who was Secretary of State in the Abraham Lincoln administration. And so, again, you have the image here and the transcription here. And to give an example of what I was saying, as far as people using pet names, well, it talks about Papa. Well, who's Papa? It's Elijah Miller. And noting that Fanny Bennett, well, we can't help you with that because we don't know who that is. But of course, somebody who knows should read this. They could provide information on that individual. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And did that kind of sort of answer your question as far as letting folks see some of the various digital editions are out there? And I really encourage people to go and look for things. It's really interesting what people can do. And the list on that one slide is only a start.
That is really cool to see, especially the pop-up of who the person is, particularly with the pet names. So that's really cool to see. And I can only imagine the possibility with having a system like that where you can use that for transcription and just really enrich the collection.
Well, you can do it kind of as two-stage as well, because I've seen this, in that you get a pop-up that gives you some basic information. It may be more than a name. It might be, very short who this person is, like, like Secretary of State and dates. But the pop-up window has a little link. And if you click on the link, it takes you to like a short biography of who this person is. And then you can go back to reading the document, but it allows you to find out more about okay, he was Secretary of State. I want to know a little bit more about this guy. Or nowadays, this woman.
That's very cool.
Yeah, you can, obviously that adds layers of complexity as far as design is concerned. And I didn't mention this in my presentation, but it means that you might want to consider when you're doing your transcription, do it, TEI, text encoding initiative, where you can embed things that will help, an online system interpret them. One of the visualizations in the Washington financial papers is actually of a trip that he made, basing it on, he was keeping track of his expenses. So what they did was, okay, £1, 6 shillings, Baltimore, Maryland. Well, with Baltimore, Maryland, they embedded a GPS code in that, a GeoID code. And so they could use that GeoID code to make their story map. To show, okay, here's a location where something happened. So there are all kinds of things that you can do to help with that context. It depends on the usual staff, time, money, etc. But you can do some really impressive things. And even if there's not a lot you can do, there are still some, kind of low cost things that you can do that will, enhance the reader's experience and help them understand what it is they're reading.
It's really nice. And staff, time, and money, which we all have in abundance. I mean,
yeah,
I wish. So thank you so much. I think, we're coming down to the final minute. So I want to thank you so much for your presentation, Jim, and thank you all for attending. Our next set of sessions will be at 11:30. So you'll have a 15-minute window for a break. And so we'll see you back, and you'll just need to follow the links for those sessions. So thank you all, and thank you, Jim. Be well.
Okay, take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.